Welcome to the Best of Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian. In February of 2008, I interviewed Karen Goodrow, who was then the director of the Connecticut Innocence Project, and James Tillman, a man who had served 18.5 years in prison until exonerated by DNA evidence. 8 years have gone by since that interview. Karen Goodrow is now a judge for the Connecticut Supreme Court in New Haven, and James Tillman is the co-author with Jeff Kimball of the book, The Power of Conviction. This Best of Full Bloom is an edited version of the original interview. I hope you enjoy this look back in time.
Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following. Welcome to Full Bloom, the award-winning show that celebrates life. Here's your host, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Full Bloom. I'm Zita Christian. How many times have you heard someone say, "Oh, I saw someone who could be your twin, someone who looks so much like you, could be your twin sister or twin brother"? What do you suppose would happen if that person who bore such a resemblance to you wound up causing you to be arrested and imprisoned for a crime that you didn't commit? We're going to talk about that tonight because I have two very, very special guests who are intimately familiar with what can happen. My first guest is Karen Goodrow. She is the director for the Connecticut Innocence Project. And also with me is James Tillman, the man who was wrongly accused, arrested, spent 18 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, and was eventually exonerated. They're both with us tonight. I'm going to talk about the Innocence Project and James about your experience. So Karen, let me first start with you to get some basic information about the Connecticut Innocence Project itself. How long has it existed? And give me a little overview.
Sure. The Connecticut Innocence Project has been up and running for about 3.5 years. It was the brainchild, if you will, of Jerry Smythe, who was our former chief public defender. And when we first started it, I was the co-chair with Brian Carlo. I was interested in misidentification and false conviction cases, and Brian is our resident expert on DNA. He is actually presently our deputy chief public defender. But Jerry had this idea, and at the time our present chief public defender, Susie Story, was our deputy chief, and she was also supportive of the enterprise, if you will. So we started it really with a paper box, cardboard box. Brian and I were both basically running different public defender offices, and in our spare time we were taking requests from inmates who were claiming their innocence.
How's it funded?
It's presently funded through independent state funding, designated funding. We have 4 positions. Mike LaFave is our other attorney at the office, Joan O'Rourke is the administrative assistant, and Pete Palmer is the investigator. But when we first started, there wasn't designated funding, and so as I mentioned, Brian and I were both running separate county, if you will, public defender offices, and essentially reviewing cases in our spare time. When we started, yeah, we had maybe a day a week that we could devote to it.
So even now, even funded now, it's not huge in terms of the number of staff.
Right, there's 4 of us total, but I can tell you that we really appreciate the fact that the legislature gave us funding in the summer.
I bet,
yeah.
I bet. Tell me what led you to James Tillman's case.
Yeah. I love telling the story because it's really Brian Carlo's doing, and whenever I say this, Brian doesn't have any recollection of this. What we were doing back when we were first starting looking at the cases, James came to our attention, which is to say we actually finally had an opportunity to look at his case somewhere around January of '06. Now sometimes James and I disagree on dates, but we try to agree whenever possible, but it was somewhere in January of '06. But we had heard from him at least a good 10, 11, 12 months prior to that. We just simply didn't have the resources to be able to get to his case before then. Brian actually was the one, when we were looking at the case together, who noted that the trial, which was in 1989, was just about the time when some cases were starting to look at DNA, but it was a little bit too early in Connecticut. It wasn't until the early 1990s that DNA really started to be utilized more often. So Brian said, gee, this is a case that we may be able to find the evidence and get some DNA off of it.
Is the availability of DNA evidence an important consideration, and are there other considerations?
There are many considerations. If you went to the Public Defender website, you would see a link to the Connecticut Innocence Project, and it tells you what our criteria is. At that point in time, what we were trying to do essentially was review cases sort of in the order in which we heard from inmates. It turns out that that's a more difficult task to do. So we don't limit our acceptance of cases based on biological evidence or DNA, as some innocence projects do. But in this particular case, it was just really the timing that at that point we were able to sit down and look at James's case, and Brian, because of his expertise in DNA, recognized that it was one of those cases that potentially with the new DNA technology we might be able to get a result.
Okay. James, I want to go back in time for a minute. I believe you were 26 years old, is that right, when all of this happened initially, when you were arrested? Can you tell us a little, like, what was it like that day?
I mean, I was arrested, and I was brought down to the police station, and I was being questioned and being charged. And then I finally got charged with sexual assault.
I can't imagine. I mean, here you are living your life. You were working in a car wash. You have a job. You have a family, and suddenly your world changes.
Yeah,
did you think at that point, oh, this is a mistake? I mean, they'll figure it out. This can't go on.
Yeah, I did. I thought that at first, but then after time went by and after I found myself just moving on through the system and moving on, and then I spent almost I think almost going on 2 years in the county jail before I even went to trial. And at which time I was brought to trial during the time of another highly publicized case was going on. And I was like, wow, you know, what a time to bring me to trial, you know. So
well, now I'm curious. Yeah, I don't understand the implication. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think the import of it was that this was what James, I think, is communicating, is that at the time that his case went to trial, there was a very high-profile case that was being tried in Harford County at the same time. And what that tends to do is that tends to be publicized in the newspaper. Jurors tend to feel that there's a lot of increased crime. They feel that way anyway when one is looking at the city of Harford versus the suburbs. And so it would be difficult, I think, to be in James's shoes and feel as though you're going to get a fair trial when at the very same time this highly publicized, very serious case was going on.
Okay, I understand. So James, when you were arrested, and obviously you know you didn't do it, what does your family say? What do your friends say? Your coworkers?
Well, I mean, at that time I was in prison. I mean, I was in the county jail, and you know, I guess, you know, I don't know actually what they would say because I was locked up, but you know, my mother, she was there for me and she believed in me, and you know, that mattered, you know, and she just stuck by me. When
the day came that you went to trial and that the jury found you guilty, how did you explain all that to yourself?
You know, at that time I was angry, you know, very, very angry.
I can't imagine not being. Yeah.
But I kind of understand it now, you know, whereas you're angry, you know, and things happen, you know, people, you know, they lose their kids in wars, you know, people get cancer, people, you know, it's just things in life happen, and I have to look at this like a thing that happened, you know, and, you know, I don't want to accuse anybody of you know, of just picking me out because I know how it feels to be accused. So, you know, my thing is that I just have to look at it as a mistake. I have to look at it just like if you hit someone, you know, you didn't mean to, it was a mistake. So, I mean, mistakes I guess they happen in different ways, and I guess this might have been a way that it happened for me, and you know, it's just, I'm just glad I'm able to come back from it. You know, I mean, I'm still here and I'm free, so you know, it's a good thing.
All right, so James, tell me, do you remember the day that you first met Karen?
I was at the prison, and they said you have a visit, and I went out to the visiting room, and I seen this beautiful lady.
Yes,
that was the guard, and then they ushered Brian and I in.
And I see this beautiful lady, and I was like, "Oh, she come to see." I don't know her, you know. Yeah. And then I seen Brian, and you know, Brian had on I think he had on a blue suit, and you know, he looked like he was very important, you know, like very important man. You know, he was a very important man, and you know, you could tell when when someone come around you and they mean business, and you know, and I seen him, and I don't know, I broke down crying because I felt something happening there, and they said it was from the Innocence Project, and I was like,
I get chills just thinking about that.
I mean, just, you know, even though I didn't think I was going home or anything, but just the feeling of knowing someone's trying to help you, that was like.
Now, how long had you been incarcerated at that point?
I think it was over 15 years, right? It was about 15 years.
Oh, no, it was 18.
Oh, it was 18 years.
By the time you met us, sure.
That's right.
That was 18 years. February of '06, and he was released a few months later in June.
Oh, so it all happened quickly once you took on the case.
Well, it was actually finding the physical evidence that was the worst part. In 1991, the evidence, which was the dress and the stockings worn by the victim on the night that she was attacked, that evidence was subjected to DNA testing in 1991, but it was the old technology. And so I refer to that as the non-result report. There was nothing that was helpful. It was a non-result. And the mystery was trying to locate that evidence. Ultimately, Legal Aid of Hartford located a box in their archives, and it contained the evidence. And that took getting from the day that we met James to the day of locating that evidence was, for me, the most stressful time.
But was there something about him in particular that made you say, I want to work with this man?
Well, I think, you know, you want to be very careful that you're not making these very important decisions based on subjective feeling about someone. You know, our criteria is basically, is there some new evidence that can help to prove innocence, assuming that it's a Connecticut conviction and the person is indigent and incarcerated. But Brian and I collectively at that point have probably had 50 years of experience representing people charged with offenses, and it would be nice if we could have a litmus test that you can, you know, shine a light in somebody's eye and decide, are they telling the truth or not. Of course you don't know that, but there was an incredible sense, the same that you see him sitting here, of sincerity about him, and we spoke to him, and it was a very emotional time for James and for us. We tried to put a good game face on, but it was very emotional. And when we said to him at that point, you know, we don't know, A, whether we can find the evidence, and if we do, we can't guarantee you whether there will be a result or what the result will be. And his response was essentially what you hear today. It doesn't matter. What matters to me is that you're here and you're willing to look at it, and it seemed very sincere. And I remember distinctly walking out of the visiting area at the Cheshire prison after having left James, and we were going through the metal detector, and Brian and I looked at each other and we said, oh, he's innocent. We both had that clear, distinct feeling from meeting him.
Who told your mother that the Innocence Project was now involved?
They let me use the phone when I left y'all, and I called her and told her that the Innocence Project was getting involved in my case.
Tell me about the day. I mean, you were released in June of 2006. What was that day like?
They told me to get some clothes, so I had my cousin get some clothes for me, and
a nice a suit so that he could appear before the judge presentably, not in his prison uniform. Like
a shirt and the pants. It was just a nice shirt and the pants that my cousin had sent over, and I had put it on, and it just felt good just to put on, a color, that's
regular street clothes.
Yeah, street clothes, and just with the silk shirt, it's like, wow. we went out in front of the judge, and Karen and Brian went out there, and Brian, he just so smart when it comes to DNA, and he just like, I could just feel his presence, and he just like, he knew what he was doing, and I could just like, you know, my life is right there, and I could just see he just had, I don't know, he just seemed like one of the best lawyers in the world.
And this was
and he is
a big day. I mean, obviously, this was the day that did they give you the decision that day? Is that how it worked?
Yeah.
Is that how it works?
Yep. And we, after we was talking to the judge, it seemed like they was like gearing towards not letting me go. So I'm saying, oh my goodness, and I'm thinking back at Cheshire, back no central area. I'm like, all my stuff going. I'm like, oh my goodness, I really don't want to go back there. And you know how you just, I mean, after 18 and a half years, you know, I got a possibility to go home, and it's like, I don't know, I just was. And then
that had to be high, though. I mean, it had to be a heightened sense of hope because you'd given your things away.
Yeah.
This had to be the moment where you thought, finally, everything changes.
Yeah, but when the sheriff came over to me and said that who I want to give the clothes back to, that means I'm going to put back on the prison issue clothes. So when he said that, I mean, he knows some things that we don't know.
Oh, gosh.
But Karen them knew some other stuff that he didn't know.
Yeah.
Their lawyer. So, you know, Brian sprung into action, and he started to, you know, hit the DNA side of it, and then Karen, she sprung into action on the legal side and case versus, she was going crazy. And then Your Honor was like, well, you know, I need to read, and they was like, look, Your Honor, and then Brian just stepped out and just, look, Your Honor, we'll do it this way, and he just threw it all at him, and then she just came like she was possessed with case versus, and then and then Your Honor was like, y'all basically y'all overproved.
He was kindly telling me, it's okay,
Enough.
enough already.
Going,
But your passion, clearly your passion was evident. And
yes, it was, and I was like, Karen, and she's like, just, and I was like, thank you.
So at that moment, I mean, right then, does the judge say, here's my decision?
He had to basically made the decision, but she was like...
There were some legal, that we don't have to get into the details of, but there were legal hoops, and so both sides agreed to stipulate to certain things, to agree to certain things that had occurred at the first trial, and the prosecution was very cooperative. And felt that the right thing also was for James to be released that day. So really, we were all on the same page. We all felt it was the right thing for him to be released. We just had to figure out the appropriate way legally for that to happen on that day. And when we all got to that point, the judge granted the petition for new trial and released James on his promise to appear, that he'd come back to court, which of course we did the following month, and the charges were all dismissed.
So you walk out of the court that day?
There was a little bit of time that elapsed between when the judge ordered his release and when he was actually released. It was almost, an hour and a half, having to do with other administrative stuff that occurs.
So you wait.
So it was a lot of waiting, and so we were still visiting him through the visiting room in the lockup, even though the court had already ordered him released. But then finally, the elevator door opened. Why don't you tell us, Zita, about that moment?
Yeah, it opened and my mother was right there, and I was like, I don't think I hugged my mother in like, I think it was about 6 years, I think, since I hugged my mother, and I was able to hug her, and it was just a wonderful day, and I was like, and then and then we went out and the press was out there, and it was just a beautiful day. It was a wonderful day.
People ever talk about that, like, I would do that if I knew I would get $5 million at the end? Do you think people would, really?
Well, I think most people that I talk to, they more or less say that that's not enough money for them to be locked up. I guess any normal person, I say normal because I don't think you can put a price on your freedom. I don't think you can put a price on walking outside and just seeing the sun, and just feeling the rain. I think that's priceless. I just want them to be able to forgive. I want them to be able to know that their choices could cost them their lives.
That's important.
I done seen kids in prison that I talk to, and these kids is just like, I mean, some could sing, some could do poetry, some could write. It's just, I just see so much talent, and I seen it from all walks of life. I seen it, the rich kids, the middle class kids, the poor kids, and jail doesn't discriminate against any of them. And just being careful and making the right decisions, because making the wrong decision could cost you your life. It could cost you being incarcerated. Can't nobody help you, and I just want them to be able to forgive, because sometimes they get caught up into the system because they wasn't able to forgive. Maybe this guy bumped him, and maybe he was with his girlfriend, and maybe the guy jumped on him and then beat him up in front of his girlfriend, and then he goes and do something stupid that may cost him his life, because he was disrespected that day. But when you're in prison, you're disrespected every day because you have a loss of your freedom. So that's disrespect, being able to not, use the bathroom, in private. That's disrespect. Being able to be felt on, searched down by a man, that's disrespect. Being able to get stripped in front of a officer, that you really don't feel like being, getting undressed in front of, that's disrespect. Being in a cell. So, I'm saying, do you want to that one day disrespect where you can move on with your life, where you can just forgive and move on with your life and be successful and just live a good life? Or do you want to just take that day and just mess up your whole life with it, and be disrespected every day? So I just want them to know, that, life is real and your choices is real, and, just jail it's the worst. It's worse. It's not good.
Karen, I want to go back to you for a moment and thinking about James' case relative to the other cases that have come to the Innocence Project. When you look at all of them, how would you classify James' case relative to the others?
The hardest part is what we talked about before. The most difficult part was locating the evidence. And that was done with the help, I've said this many times before, with the help of many people, the folks at the courthouse in Hartford, the Hartford Police Department who searched their records, our friends at the Forensic Lab, who of course were ultimately responsible for conducting the testing that freed James. Our friends at Legal Aid. I mean, it goes on and on and on. What has happened, I think, as a result of this case is I have sort of become the face of the Connecticut Innocence Project. Brian and I, as I said, were working on this together prior, and one doesn't see all of the individuals. It's not just agencies. They weren't agencies who went and looked through their dusty old archives. They were people. And these were people, many of whom, some we knew. I knew some of the folks from the Hartford court, but many of the people who did this, they did it on a wing and a prayer because somebody called them and said, gee, would you mind going to do this? And I think that in and of itself is such an important factor that sometimes gets lost in all of this. So in terms of how is his case, or does his case stand out, I think it stands out for that issue of trying to locate the evidence. It turns out that in many cases throughout the United States, people are unable to find the evidence, and this is not an uncommon problem. The other thing is that many people, probably because of the CSI effect, have this belief that in every criminal case there is biological evidence that can be subjected to DNA testing, when indeed the vast majority of the inmates who we have heard from, their cases do not involve DNA, or perhaps they're not DNA determinative. So I would never say that any case was easy, but in a case like James, where it's a stranger rape and there's a misidentification and finally the evidence is found and finally the testing is done, all of the ducks ultimately got in a row, and we're fortunate for that.
I wondered, James, in your experience, one of the things that we also always, just the layman thinks about in terms of being arrested, oh, well, of course you're presumed innocent. until proven guilty. Oh, and maybe Karen, let me ask you, do you think that's the case? I mean,
well, it's certainly the law. Do I believe, you know, I've tried a lot of cases and had a lot of jury trials. Do I believe that jurors presume somebody to be innocent? I think that they understand that that's the instruction from the judge, and I think they try very hard to follow that. But I think we are asking too much of mere human beings who are called in for jury duty, and they're seated, you know, when they are brought in the large panel, it could be anywhere from 40 to 100 folks who see somebody like James. Oftentimes, if it's a minority, James is the only minority at the table with the prosecution and the defense lawyer, usually, or not always, but oftentimes the staff in the courtroom are often white, and depending on the jury pool, interesting we're having this discussion because one of the main issues in James's direct appeal was the question of whether the jury pool did not contain enough non-whites, essentially. And again, that's another show. We won't get into too much detail, but that was one of the legal issues that was raised in his appeal. And so in certain jurisdictions, there are very, very few minorities, perhaps, who live in the jurisdiction and perhaps who are ever called to jury duty. And then they hear, well, the state of Connecticut is charging Mr. Tillman with the crimes of kidnapping and robbery and sexual assault in the first degree, and we as a system want to believe that those jurors are not staring at that person who is on trial and not believing on some level, well, he must be guilty of something, or what are we all doing here? And through the voir dire process, which we'll talk about more on March 5th, the attempt is to educate the juror and also to get at any potential bias. Some people, quite frankly, say very honestly, yeah, I feel in my heart this person's done something. Otherwise, we wouldn't all be here.
Well, let me take this whole concept of juries and jury service one step further. James, tell me, after your experience, let's say now that you are called to jury duty, how do you feel about serving?
I never really thought of that. I don't know. I don't think that right now. I don't know. I just don't feel that that's something I would want to do right now. I wouldn't want to.
Be a hard place for you to be in, maybe at the moment.
Yeah,
maybe down the line.
Because I don't, I mean, how about the jury that was on my case? How do they feel now? I mean, I don't know. I just don't feel
That's an interesting question.
That I don't know. I just don't feel that I'm ready for that. I don't feel that.
All right.
That there's something that I really shouldn't really look at right now. I mean, I don't know. I don't really want to judge anybody right now.
Full Bloom is brought to you in part by the following: